I like to ask a question. Have you encountered severe life storms? I'm not talking about storm outside one. I'm talking about life storm. Storms in your life. Even while you have been faithfully obeying God's explicit direction. Maybe you have prayed about a decision. You sought maybe wise counsel from pastors or some church leaders. And you also felt God's leading. And suddenly, bam! The storm hits in your life. Financial struggles. It could be financial struggles. It could be health crisis. It could be marital or family conflicts, spiritual battles, or emotional distress. Now these storms, I believe, create fear in us, doubt and anxiety, and leave us wondering, does God even care about me here on earth? Now I trust that today's message will serve as a lesson for us on how Jesus uses the storms in life to reveal his divine identity and also to foster a deeper spiritual trust in him. So this brings me to my first point, the reluctant voyage and the vital solitude. Let's read Mark chapter 6 verse 45 to 46 together. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Now I want you to pay attention to one particular word that we might miss. That word is made. Okay? You see, it says that immediately Jesus made, or he compelled, or he forced his disciples to get into the boat to go ahead while he dismissed the crowd. This is the crowd where before then, just to give you the context, okay, Jesus has been feeding the 5,000 people, okay, and after feeding them, okay, he made the disciples get into the boat, okay, while he dismissed the crowd, and after leaving them, he went out to the mountainside to pray. The word made, okay, in English or in Greek actually means to compel them or to force them, to force the disciples to get into the boat and go to the other side. See, the Greek verb that is used here, made or compel, is very, very strong. Whether they like it, it's not a casual thing, you know. Jesus didn't say, you can decide whether you want to get into the boat or not. Okay? But he made them get into the boat. Now you may ask this question, why would Jesus compel the disciples to get into the boat? If Jesus is the Son of God, he would know there's a storm that is coming. He actually compelled them to get into the boat in order actually to protect them from the temptations of earthly pride and the adrenaline of the recent success of the feeding of 5,000 people. That's what Jesus wanted to do, is to protect them from the temptation of spiritual pride okay, or having to enjoy the success. And then Jesus retreated up to the mountain to pray. Now this is the first lesson of the passage. Jesus goes to pray. And this is what I call the priority. Sorry, I need to move on. Okay, the priority of intimacy. You see, Jesus retreats to pray actually demonstrates to us that ministry flows out from a personal intimacy with God. The mountain is actually a place of divine perspective. From below, the storm looks life-threatening. But from above, Jesus makes sure the storm is under his absolute control. He is still in control. The disciples are exactly where Jesus told them to be, in the boat. And they are doing exactly what Jesus had commanded them to do, in the boat. And yet, they are about to face the most terrifying night of their lives. And here's a key takeaway for us. Sometimes, facing a storm in our lives does not automatically mean that you are being punished by God, or that you are out of God's will. See, we need to understand that sometimes the hardest storms that we face in life, where we are in exact obedience to Christ, it tells us that God is doing something in the storms of your life. And this brings us to the second point. The storm as a classroom. Let's read Mark chapter 6, verse 47 to 48a. Okay, together. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Let me paint a picture for you. The perfect storm in the making. And I took a picture, I googled, okay, I took one picture that a storm that was brewing, okay, at the Sea of Galilee. You see, the Sea of Galilee is famous for sudden violent storms. Why? It's because it sits at 600 feet below sea level. Okay? And the cold air comes from the Mediterranean, rushes down the gorges, okay, and hits the warm air over the lake. And within minutes, okay, calm water can turn into a 6-foot waves. And that's what happened to the disciples. Now notice Mark's description here. It seems like Jesus doesn't care, right? Jesus sees the disciples straining against the wind from afar during the fourth watch. Now the fourth watch, okay, in our biblical understanding, it's actually around 3 a.m. to around 6 a.m. And that is the time where you are most sleepy and tired, right? So human strength is at its lowest. They had been rowing against this headwind. And you might ask, why didn't Jesus intervene immediately? Remember, he's up on the mountain, on land. The disciples were in the boat. Why? It's because the storm was doing a necessary work in the lives of the disciples, stripping them away of their self-reliance on natural strength. The night before, remember, the disciples and Jesus fed the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and they had 12 baskets full of leftovers. But now they only got empty stomachs and an arcing arm rowing the oars. So instead of asking this question, God, why do you allow the storm in my life? I think we need to start asking, what is this storm revealing to me? What is this storm of life revealing to me? Is it exposing my self-reliance on my own strength? Is it showing where my faith falters? You see, if our boat is smooth sailing, we would never see Jesus walking on the water in the storms of our lives. If the boat is smooth sailing, we will never see Jesus in the storms of our lives. And that's why God assures us comfort in trials. He assures us comfort. We are never invisible to God during those exhausting emotional, financial, or relational struggles that we face in life. Why? It's because God sees our exhaustions. He sees our tears when no one is watching. And He sees also the bills that we don't even know how to pay. He knows them all. He sees a marriage on the brink or on the verge of breaking down. He sees your child that you have been praying for who has wandered off from God. He knows it. He sees it. We are never invisible to Jesus. So as the disciples were straining, let me say this, and I have to emphasize this. Jesus is still seeing us straining or struggling with the obstacles and trials that we face in life. And this brings us to the third point. The misinterpretation of grace. Mark chapter 6 verse 48b to 50. Together. Shortly after dawn, He went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but then they saw Him walking on the lake. They thought He was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw Him and were terrified. Immediately He spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Now we come to what I call the strangest part of this story or narrative. Jesus was walking on the water in the storm towards the disciples in the boat. But Mark adds on a very puzzling phrase. He says he was about to pass by them. Now, what does that mean? To pass by them. Was Jesus actually ignoring their plight, their trials, their storm? No, not at all. See, because this is one of the most theologically loaded phrases in Mark's entire gospel. It is called theophany or divine revelation. Okay? It's one of the most profound Old Testament allusion to a theophany. A theophany means a visible manifestation of God. Jesus's intention to pass by them actually echoes the Old Testament revelations. Let me give you two examples. One is in Exodus chapter 33, verses 19 to 22, where God revealed his glory to Moses. Okay? He passed by him. He doesn't allow Moses to see his face or God's face to face. He hides him behind the cliff and he passes by. The manifestation of God. Another one is in the example where God spoke to Elijah on Mount Horeb. He passed him by in 1 Kings chapter 19 verse 11, signaling God's divine identity, the great I am. When Jesus was walking on the waves and passing by, he was actually declaring his divine divinity, his identity. He is the creator God who treads upon the waves of the sea. He is God who not only made the storms, but also can calm the storm. Yet, look at this tragic comedy of unbelief in verse 49 and 50. But when they saw him walking on the lake, what the verse says, they thought he was a ghost. 有鬼啊！睇到鬼啊！ The disciples thought they saw the ghost. Because they saw him, and because they saw a ghost, they were terrified. And immediately Jesus spoke words of comfort to them. And this is what Jesus said. Take courage. It is I. Whenever he says, it is I, he's actually saying, I am the great I am. Don't be afraid. See, I believe that the disciples in the storm must have prayed. And they actually prayed for deliverance, to be saved from the storm. And yet when the deliverance arrived in an unexpected form, they actually panicked. They were terrified. The storms actually dissipated immediately the moment Jesus steps and gets into the boat. And now you may be asking, but Stephen, I invited Jesus in, and the storm is still raging in my life. And this is my favorite part of the entire narrative or the story. This is what we need to see. When the Lord walks on the water into our messy, leaky, storm-tossed boat, the storm in your life, I want you to understand that Jesus actually enters into your situation or crisis situation. He's there. And immediately Jesus speaks words of restorative presence. Jesus offers immediate comfort. He says, take courage. It is I am that I am, the great I am. He says, don't be afraid. And when he steps in, he calms the storm upon stepping into that boat. When Jesus says, it is I, he actually used the Greek phrase, ego eimi, which means I am. Okay? Here, Jesus is using the same name that God used for himself. Remember, if you have been following Pastor's sermon on faith, the faith of Moses, okay, and when when Pharaoh wanted to ask, who are you? And Moses say, who am I to tell these people or the Israelites? Okay, and Moses say, and God says to Moses, I am that I am. And that is the same word Jesus used. Okay? I am. The divine I am. He isn't just saying, hey guys, it's me. Okay? But he's actually declaring to all of us, I am the great I am. He is the self-existent God, eternal, a covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now he's standing in the storm of your life. That's why Jesus said, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. And this brings us to the fourth point, the hardness of heart. Mark chapter 6 verse 51 and 52. Together, let's read. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. See, when Jesus stepped into the boat, the wind immediately ceased. And the disciples were utterly astounded. And Mark gave us a very sobering diagnosis of their shock. Their hearts were hardened. Their hearts were hardened. The disciples were actually missing the message. Despite witnessing the recent miracles of the feeding of the 5,000, okay, the disciples remain amazed due to their hardened hearts that focuses on the power of the miracle instead of the person of Jesus Christ. And that's the problem with hardened hearts. Instead of focusing on the power of God at work, we fail to focus on the person of Jesus Christ, who says, I am that I am. they failed to grasp who Jesus was. So we need, dear church, to be aware or beware of the danger of forgetfulness. You see, hardened hearts stem from the failure to actually connect the dots of remembering God's past faithfulness and the intentional remembrance that restores spiritual clarity in our life. And the antidote or the solution to the hardness of heart is actually found in Mark chapter 8 verse 18 with this key question. Jesus say, "Don't you remember? Don't you remember?" And that's why it's so important whenever we partake of the Holy Communion. You know what Jesus says to us? Do this in remembrance of me. Do this in remembrance of me. Why? Because when we take the Holy Communion, it reminds us what Jesus did for us on the cross. He died for our sins. And not only that He died for our sins, 3 days later, He rose from the dead. He conquered death, He conquered Satan, He conquered sin. That's why Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And that's the solution to the hardness of heart. So when the storm subsided, the boat landed on the shore, and then the scene changed. Let's take a look at the last part, the desperate shore. Mark chapter 6 verse 53 to 56 together. I know it's a bit small, but let's try and read. Okay. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard He was. And wherever He went, into villages, towns, and countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplace. They begged Him to let them touch even the edge of His cloak. And all who touched it were healed. See, the scene now completely changed. It shifts over. The storm is over. The boat is anchored. Now we see the other side of Jesus' healing ministry. The contrast of faith. Do you notice this contrast in faith? Upon reaching the land, the desperate crowds run to Jesus. If you contrast it with the disciples, what happened in the boat? They were doubting and in fear. And Mark records a very stunning statement. He says, all who touch it, the edge of Jesus' cloak, there was complete healing. Everyone who touches even the edge of His cloak will heal, illustrating God's abundant grace and compassion. Still remember on Mother's Day, I preached about the woman who was bleeding for 12 years. What did that woman do? He touched the edge of Jesus' cloak. And that God's residual grace power flowing not from a ritual of touching, but from the person of Jesus Christ. And that's why I need to emphasize this. It has nothing to do, okay, with whatever events that took place, but it has to do with who Jesus is. Jesus, a trustworthy God. And this is the powerful picture of God's overflowing, available grace to you and me in our storms of life. Power that flows not from empty religious rituals, but from a personal contact with the person of Jesus Christ. Now, this is the heart of Jesus' outreach ministry. Notice how the people respond. They actually run. They run. They carry. They even beg. There's urgency in their faith. Let me ask all of us here, when was the last time we actually ran to Jesus like the desperate crowd? I want to contrast the disciples in the boat and also the desperate crowd on land. In the boat, the disciples were afraid. Why were they afraid? Not only it's a storm, they thought Jesus was actually a ghost. They were afraid. But on the shore, the crowds ran to him. In the boat, the disciples doubted. But on the shore, the desperate believed. If only they could touch the edge of Jesus' cloak. In the boat, the disciples' heart were hardened. On the shore, the crowd, the desperate crowd, the sick were healed. So in conclusion, there are two groups, but there is only one question. Two groups of people. The disciples and the crowd. Group one is those people, the disciples, the exhausted disciples in the boat. And group two, the desperate crowd on the shore. This morning, let us ask ourselves, which group are we in? Are we still the disciples in the boat? Fearful? Doubtful? I want us to understand that in the storms of our life, Jesus still sees you and I straining in the trials of our life, in the difficult moments of our life. And I want to echo what Jesus says. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Because Jesus is the self-existent God. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And He is still the same. Yesterday, today, and forever. He will never change. He is always a faithful God. Or are we like the desperate, the crowd, the second group, the desperate crowd on shore? You see, you and I actually don't need perfect faith, or what I call clean life. All the crowd did was just reach for the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. The application for us this morning is this: will you and I continue to trust the great I Am who enters into your life storm, heals your brokenness, and walks alongside with you? Let us pray.